Welcome to the First Case Expert Series. I'm Melanie Perry, and we're speaking with our perioperative instrument coordination expert, Jeff Wertz. Jeff, what are we going to be talking about today?
Hello, Melanie. We're going to go through communication visibility with kind of an end goal of setting the table for how you can begin this process, establish a cadence with actionable measures and how to kind of begin discussing this kind of, unformed space of the communication with SPD and OR, where there's, I think, a lot of these conversations taking place. A lot of facilities or systems may be doing something along these lines, but there oftentimes is not enough structure or starting point for a lot of them. So that's really where we wanted to start with. So kind of from my perspective, when we were initially going through this and evaluating it, I think, what I've seen in my experience going to a lot of hospitals as a rep, and then also from a software development perspective to bring solutions to this space, is there's not enough communication taking place. I think there's a lot of finger pointing from both sides, whether it's warranted or not. I think understandably, there's a lot of, it's their responsibility to do this, it's their responsibility to do this, and not a lot of clarity around the why behind it, who's in charge of which part of it, when they're in charge of it. And I think you've probably experienced this much more than I have, but when the crap hits the fan, who's left holding the bag and how do we address it moving forward? And I think when this isn't established to begin with, it can create a lot of barriers between the department, to the extent where, I've seen facilities where the OR manager does not speak with the SPD manager. And I think that's a pretty scary place for systems to be at from a patient perspective. That's not anything that I would want to be a part of. And I think, this is a team, and there needs to be some clear foundation in place of communication.
I couldn't agree more. I'm right here. I'm like, yes, I'm cheering for Jeff. You're so right. But where do we start? How do we begin the process?
Yeah, I think, it's starting small. So I think, any executive would definitely check this off as a box of an initiative that wants to get going. And I think it starts with anyone that's listening to this to begin a conversation and extend an olive branch to the other department and say, hey, let's set up some regular cadence. Start small with where you're at. It doesn't have to be a big production. I think people overanalyze this in a lot of senses. Of it could be as simple as, hey, let's get together for coffee every Monday morning, Friday afternoon, and kind of go through what you're facing, the challenges that you're facing, and the challenges that we're facing, either side of it, and just get a better understanding. And I think it starts with, for sure, to begin with, is SPD and the OR, and setting up, a conversation around that. What are you facing? How did things go this week? What do you have upcoming this following week? Because it still astounds me when we go into some of these hospitals where the OR doesn't have any clue all of the steps that it takes for sterile processing, and that they have no insight to the surgery board and how many cases are coming up next week, and they're walking in flying blind. And I think that's just a really low-hanging fruit that could be addressed of, what are the big days next week, so that can then be communicated to the other team, and vice versa, where now OR can go and say, hey, we have this many cases. On average, that's X number of trays for SPD to be dealing with. I think that, I've heard of some hospitals having that process when you're going into it, that you're going to spend some time with SPD, and SPD is going to spend some time up in the OR. And I think those are really, really easy things that can be, that you can start off with.
It's so easy to say and then to put into practice. Sometimes it can be challenging just because of the past, because of people's experiences before. But it is so true that if we can come together and actually communicate our needs from an OR standpoint and a sterile processing standpoint, then moving forward, we can have something better than we've had before. I know that in my own facility, we were having issues with instruments not being ready on our really big days. And that really boiled down to our sterile processing just didn't know what our big days were. They, like you said, kind of sometimes were flying blind. And a meeting where we all came together, no pointing fingers, no passing blame. How would this help? How can we make sure that we're prepared for these really big days? And they're like, well, what are the really big days? So that was the simple first thing, the simple first step. Well, Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Fridays are our biggest orthopedic days. And then we go from there. So a very simple piece of communication that then helps to enable our teammates to be prepared benefits the whole OR.
And I think being proactive in that is the first step. So I think, I'd be curious, what in those conversations when you're communicating with SPD and in your experience at other facilities, where have you seen breakdowns of this taking place? Have you seen, more people being involved with it and then it gets convoluted and then the wheels kind of come off because there's too many people involved with it? Or have you seen this becomes an issue after something bad has happened? And oftentimes these are reactive scenarios where you put together one of these groups and then it kind of fizzles after 3-4 months. Has that been your experience? What do you think contributes to that?
So I think one experience for sure, actually talking about, the communication about our really big orthopedic days in our OR actually had to do with the fact that we were consistently not having what we needed. And so it was a reaction to a frustration that we finally brought us to have those conversations. And we really should have been having them a long time ago. It shouldn't have been the frustration that led to the conversation. However, the conversation then led to an improvement and an understanding of the schedule. So it was very good that we finally had it. But there are times when we did have just too many cooks in the kitchen, too many people, having ideas or trying to establish different things. And with so much coming down the pipe, we couldn't implement everything or do it like we needed to because there was a lot of confusion, a lack of understanding as to why are we doing this too, when it wasn't clearly communicated. And communication is so important. If you're starting something new, people really need to understand why, and that communication is so important. But yeah, we also had, errors that happened that then led to communication, but then that communication fizzled out after a while, meetings that didn't continue because we kind of get back into old habits and then we're right back where we started. Yeah.
I think that's probably more common than not. And I think that, my advice in seeing some of these things play out is making sure that you're establishing a clear practice or cadence of these and having a structured approach to it where there is somebody that's able to make a final decision on where there needs to be focus. I think to your point of too many cooks in the kitchen, I can already kind of imagine what that looks like is maybe a surgeon or two jumps into the mix and starts going through the laundry list of experiences that they've had most recently, and how do we approach that? That can be valuable in the first meeting, but then what are we actually doing to address it at scale and over time, and making sure that there's an agreement in place between all the different parties that are in there. And that's where I think it's critical, as you're going through this at the beginning of having the buy-in from both sides that we're going to work together on it. And then we're going to have a focused approach that is measured, that this doesn't just turn into, like we've already said with this, is we're going to go through some complaining and we'll get the bitching out of the way. But then how are we actually going to move the needle forward? So setting those initiatives and then being accountable to those initiatives and having it on both sides so that there's ownership, and that everyone understands the challenges of accomplishing it, because oftentimes these are multifactorial and there's different hands that are moving the different pieces. I think especially with this of how are we prepping for the cases? How are we, actually going through and documenting things during the case? How are we passing things back to SPD? Those key points of where there's transitions, there's a lot of information that's lost that's really valuable to be able to go back after the fact and identify, improvement opportunities or opportunities for efficiency. So you have to have that strong baseline of a cadence of a team that is bought in on it, and that there is time that's set aside to be discussing it and monitoring it and really evaluating it. So, and then kind of lastly, where I would put is having some of that bias towards action within this. All right, let's actually do something this week that we're going to evaluate. And again, not overthinking it with something that's too big and complex to be able to kick the can down the road and say, all right, let's figure out how we'll do this at the next meeting. Some of those things are going to happen, but saying, all right, this week we're going to try to do this with the expectation that that's probably going to change next week, but let's measure it in the week that we're doing it and then evaluate how we need to adjust it moving forward, because it's too cumbersome for us to document it at this point, just to kind of put some structure around it, maybe something like you recording errors that I know that we're going to spend some time on discussing later on in the series. But that is an area that is really challenging for a lot of facilities, and it's really critical at the same time, but it's challenging on both sides of this. So there needs to be some experimentation that's done, and I think you have to have the grace to be able to experiment with that and understand it, but then measure it while you're going through it is a critical component so that you're seeing progress throughout.
It's great advice. Bring everybody to the table, establish a practice, have a regular cadence, and then actually have action. Find something that you can take action on and you can get accomplished, and then move forward and do something else. And and these are the takeaways we need. This is what we need to improve, especially when we're looking at the communication between our departments. And we are already out of time. And we've only, I think, scratched the surface of a greater conversation, but we have some very good takeaways that we can immediately implement to work towards improving within our own facilities. Stay tuned next week as we learn about the role that people play in the process, and we uncover the language barriers that exist between our surgeons, our ORs, our SPDs, our vendors, and even supply chain. You don't want to miss our next interview with our expert, Jeff Wertz. Thanks for tuning into this First Case Expert Series.